Peneteca. A la menes amigos por siempre, Cinna said. Si, said Papa, friends forever. Cinna unfolded his legs and stood. He thanked us and said goodbye. Then he spoke some words that I shall never forget. Algún día correspondo a el favor. It means someday I return the favor. Cinna rolled the painting and stuck it in his bow case. Then he turned, leaped on his horse, and galloped off along the creek to the north. Did that really happen? Asked Etta. Papa chuckled. Ja, amazing the power of painting. I've never met an enemy when I'm at my easel. The food helped too, I said, and everyone laughed. But how can I write all this in my journal? Will you teach me some Spanish, Papa? Of course I will. Then he handed the Iliad to me. Happy birthday, Sophie. I am sure it is one you will never forget. True. But for one lovely day, I had forgotten the war. Thursday, May 1st, May Day. At school this morning, the boys went down to the creek and cut a young cypress for our maypole dance. They stripped all but the upper branches. Meanwhile, we girls wove flowers into a wreath for the top. Then we fastened long ribbons of all colors to the trunk. As usual, Herr Steves assigned Thomas to dig a hole for the maypole. He loves to show off his muscles for the girls. Christine, of course, is the May Queen, and Edward is her king. I have to admit they are a handsome couple. By noon, all was ready, and our parents began to arrive with picnic baskets. Mamma could not come, but Papa brought Willie with him on Bucophilius. Mamma had made a wreath of pink roses, and Willie held it out to me like a crown. Donkey, Willie. I kissed him and placed the wreath on my head. How is that? Willie nodded eagerly. I was wearing my white muslin and gross mutter sent before the war. It has a pattern of pink roses on the borders of a tiered skirt. Rosina added a ruffle of plain white around the bottom since I am taller now, if not fuller. Etta and I took our places in the circle around the maypole, and I picked up our ribbons. Edward stood beside the maypole, tall and straight, awaiting his queen. He wore a cape thrown over one shoulder and a crown of mountain laurel. Suddenly, Christine swept between Etta and me in her satin cape and crown of red roses. Her elbow jabbed me on the arm. She tossed her blonde curls over her shoulder and glanced back. Oh, excuse me, clawing Sophie. How dare she call me that? Just because she is growing breasts and I am still a child. Only Papa can call me Klein. She thinks she's Helen of Troy, Etta whispered. I should have tripped her. I wish you had. I could not bear the smug expression on Christine's face and looked at Edward instead. He was looking at me with a smile. Had he heard what Christine said? Was he laughing at me? Just then Herr Schmiefling took up his violin and commenced playing. We danced around the maypole, weaving in and out, raising and lowering our ribbons, and the music took a hold of my body, and I forgot about all else, even Edward. When the maypole was wrapped with ribbons, Willie ran up, took my hand, and started pulling me over to Papa. Come on, Sophie, time for the picnic. As we passed by Edward, he said, You should have been the May Queen. Ah, did he really mean it? Before I could think, Willie had pulled me over to Papa. Dancing around the maypole becomes you, Sophie. You are positively glowing, Papa said. At that moment, Thomas Boyd's father stepped up to Papa. That's a mighty pretty daughter you have there, Gunther. I think Purdy is the way he pronounced it. Papa thanked him, took my arm, and started to move away. I saw your cartoon in the newspaper, the one about General Johnston, he went on. Sure wouldn't be good for you if the Vigilance Committee saw it. All my lovely thoughts fell to the ground and shattered like my glass strawberry. Papa's grip tightened. He stopped and turned to Mr. Boyd. I don't fear ruffians. Mr. Boyd glared at him. You're making a big mistake, Gunther, he said and stalked off. It filled me with dread. Is he one of them, Papa? I don't know, Sophie, but do not worry. I could not help worrying, and if truth be told, I think Papa was worried too. More and more I feel as if we are on an island in a sea of rebel rabble. Saturday, May 3rd. No sooner had I opened my journal tonight than Max began to bark. Horses were coming up the road from Cypress Creek. I stood and looked out the window. A group of men stopped at our gate. Gott im Himmel, it was the Vigilance Committee. Max barked and lunged at the gate. If anyone dismounted and tried to enter, he would attack. He is fearless, but he could not handle a half-dozen armed men. I flung on my robe and ran through Papa's studio and down the stair to the landing. Moonlight shone through the window behind me. I watched Papa take down his rifle above the door. It is always loaded and ready to fire. The horn, Papa. Go up back upstairs, Sophie. I pretended to start upstairs, but I had no intention of doing so. Silently I crept down and saw Papa unlock the door and go out onto the gallery. I ran to the doorway. Max, come, Papa said. Max stopped barking and came to Papa. Who is it then? Papa demanded. What do you want? The Vigilance Committee, came the answer. We are looking for traitors. My heart jumped and started pounding. I did not recognize the voice, but Mr. Boyd could be out there. Get off my land, Papa said, before I blow you off. I heard rustling behind me. Mamma stood there, one hand on the piano to support herself, the other on her stomach. Get off, I tell you, Papa raised his rifle. Nien, Papa, I whispered. I wouldn't use that if I was you, Gunther. Papa did not move. I wanted to run out and pull him inside the locked door. We don't like the way you're thinking, Gunther. Either you join the Confederates or you'll hang from that tree yonder. For once, blessed once, Papa kept his silence. You think real hard about it now, you hear? We'll be back for an answer. He jerked his horse around and the men started off at a gallop. Papa stood watching them go. As the sound of the galloping horses faded away, he lowered his rifle. Suddenly, Mamma moaned. I turned just in time to see her sag against the piano and hug her body. Elizabeth, Papa cried, leaning his rifle against the wall. He caught her as her knees began to fold, carried her into the bedroom, and laid her on the bed. The doctor, Frederic, she moaned. Just then Willie called from his room. Papa and I looked at each other. I'll go to Willie, I said. Ja, tell him Mamma is sick and you have to take care of her while I go to get Dr. Pfeiffer. He cupped his hands around Mamma's cheeks. I'm going, Elizabeth. Sophie is here. Mamma nodded. Hurry, then. Papa hung the rifle in its place and motioned me out of the gallery. Lock the door and make a fire in the stove, Sophie. Put on a big kettle of water. He looked closely at me. There in the moonlight. Most of all, stay with her and assure her that Dr. Pfeiffer is on the way. Hold her hand when the pain comes. I nodded, and Papa hurried off towards the barn. Mamma, Willie called again. I went to him, closing the door between their rooms. He was sitting up in the bed. Nien, I want Mamma. I took him in my arms while he fought me. Willie, it's all right. Mamma can't come right now. She's not feeling well, and Papa has gone for Dr. Pfeiffer. I rocked with him, and gradually he stopped struggling. Be Mamma's main lean and go back to sleep. I crooned. Mamma will be better tomorrow, but you must stay in bed. Do you promise? I felt him nod his head against my chest. Gooder boy, I said, and laid him down. I tiptoed into the kitchen and closed the door. My hand trembled as I opened the firebox and uncovered the coals with a stick of kindling. What if the baby comes before Dr. Pfeiffer does? When I had water heating on the stove, I hurried back to Mamma's room with a fidibus and lighted the candle beside her bed. She turned to look at me. Even in distress, she was beautiful with her blonde hair spread over the pillow. You know nothing of having a baby, Sophie, she whispered. Mean, but Dr. Pfeiffer is on the way. I know. She turned away and gathered the bedclothes in her fist. In a moment she began to moan and turn her head from side to side. Sophie, help me. What, Mamma? What shall I do? Then I remembered Papa's word. Hold her hand. I took her hand in mine and she held on. The clock struck midnight. I listened for hoofbeats. Lieber Gott, let Papa come soon, I whispered. It is funny how you can wonder what Gott is, but when trouble comes you pray. Mamma began to squeeze my hand tighter and tighter. She arched her head back and screamed. I was afraid the baby might be coming. Mamma, tell me what to do. Sophie, Willie cried from his room. She raised my hand. Go, Sophie. Willie lay in his bed whimpering. I'm sad for Mamma, he said in jerky little gasps. Is she going to die? Mean, Willie, mean. Her stomach hurts, but she won't die. I promise. You can help her by trying to sleep. I pulled him onto my lap and began to sing the lullaby that Mama always sings. Sleep, Willie, sleep. Your papa is watching the sheep. His little body grew limp in my arms, and his breathing became slower and deeper. Now and again I heard Mama moan. I knew she needed me to hold on to, so I laid Willie on his bed and pulled the bedclothes up to his chin. Mama's main lean, I whispered. All right, Sophie. When I returned to Mama, she reached out her hands. I sat down beside her and held it. As I watched her face, I heard the horses coming. A blessed sound. I hear them, Mama. Papa and Dr. Pfeiffer. I'll go let them in. She smiled and seemed to sink into the bed. I waited at the door to make sure it was really Papa. Then I heard Max's happy yelps and unlocked the door. How is she? Papa asked. It hurts her, Papa, but the baby hasn't come yet. Good, said Dr. Pfeiffer. His cheery face and pink cheeks make me feel better at once. You may bring the kettle now, Sophie, and some towels. After I had done so, he closed the door to Mamma's room. I lightened the lamp on the dining table and sat down with Papa. Why don't you go up to bed, Sophie? It's all right, Papa. I want to wait with you. He smiled. Very well. Papa, those men, I started. Not now, he said, shaking his head. I nodded. Still, I could not put them out of my mind. Would they return? We sat, waiting. Whenever Mamma cried out, Papa leaped up and walked about. After a time, Willie called, Sophie. I went to him, and he raised his little arms. I picked him up and carried him into the living room. Mamma is going to be all right, Willie. Dr. Pfeiffer is here. I sat in the rocker, and Willie looked over at Papa to see if it was really true. Papa nodded and smiled at him. I began rocking. I'll sing you a song if you close your eyes. Sweet Willie closed his eyes, and I sang softly. You live in my heart, dear. You live in my mind. He snuggled up to me. Maybe it was the song or the beating of my heart that soothed him, or both. He soon fell asleep. I rested my head on the back of the rocker and closed my eyes. The next thing I heard was a tiny cry. Papa was up, standing at the closed door. In a moment it opened, and Dr. Pfeiffer said, Come, Friedrich, and see your fine baby daughter. Papa motioned me to come also. With Willie asleep on my shoulder, I followed him. Beside Mamma lay a little bundle. Only her head was visible, and it had lots of thick black hair. Papa leaned over and kissed Mamma. Elizabeth, another beautiful daughter. Mamma looked pale and weak, but she smiled. Ja, mein Lieber. May Magdalene Elizabeth Gunther. How about Lena for short, Papa said. Mamma nodded. I want to take her back to Germany, Frederick. Papa hesitated a moment. We'll talk about it when you are stronger, Liebenstein, I promise. Mamma's word made me remember the Vigilance Committee, and for the first time I wanted to leave Texas too. But I knew, and Papa knew, that that was not possible. Now it is after midnight. Tree frogs are warbling their lullaby from the creek, but I could not sleep until I wrote everything down. Friday, May 9th. Those men have not returned, but Chief Sinna did. When I got home from school today, he was talking to Papa at our side gate with Willie standing between them. Fortunately, Mamma has to keep to her child bed for a few more days, or she would have made Papa send the chief away. Willie ran to me. Sophie, Chief Sinna brought pemmican. He held up a slice to throw me and put it in his mouth. It's good. I dismounted and Willie took my hand, pulling me to the gate. I nodded to Chief Sinna. Buenos dias. He nodded in return. Buenos dias. The chief tells me that his band is moving farther west to the Nueces River, Papa said. He came to say farewell. Oh, that's too bad. I could have taught him to read some more English words. Papa chuckled and told Sinna that what I had said. He looked at me and smiled. Gracias, señorita. Then I had a thought. Papa, I could teach him some words now, couldn't I, as a farewell gift? Sure, you could do that. Go find a book and we'll sit on the gallery. He opened the gate for me and mentioned Chief Sinna to enter. Oh, and Sophie, tell my Mamma that it is all right. I went straight to Papa's desk, opened the glass doors on the bookshelf, and got the big Shakespeare book. On the way out, I stuck my head into Mamma's room. Baby Lena was asleep in her cradle, so I whispered, Chief Sinna is here. I'm going to read some words to him. Mamma raised her head and opened her mouth. Papa said to tell you that it is all right and do not worry. She closed her eyes and let her head fall back onto the pillow. Papa and Chief Sinna were sitting side by side at the edge of the gallery. Willie was drawing on the swept path with a stick, painting, he calls it. I sat down next to Papa and opened the book. Sophie, those words are too hard and the print too small for someone just learning. Why don't you just read aloud? But he won't understand, Papa. That's all right. The words sound good anyway. He turned to Chief Sinna. Sophie Leo, Shakespeare. He pronounced the name carefully. Oh, the chief said. Yo sé Shakespeare. He knows Shakespeare, Sophie. Verdad? I asked. Sinna nodded. He spoke in Spanish to Papa and seemed to make a request. I looked at Papa. He wants you to read the last words of All Well That Ends Well, he said. Willie came and sat beside me and I read. All yet seems well, and if it ends so meet, the bitter past more welcome is the sweet. What does that mean? Willie asked. I put my arm around his shoulders. It means if the past is bitter, more welcome is the sweet. I turned to Papa. Can you explain that in Spanish? I'll try. He thought a moment and turned to speak to Sinna. The chief smiled and nodded. Shakespeare, habla la verdad. Papa said that meant Shakespeare speaks the truth. Then Sinna stood. Ahora adios, now farewell. Momento, Papa said. Sophie, go get a loaf of bread that Rosina baked this morning. Ja, Papa. I hurried to the kitchen, wrapped one in a towel, and brought it to Chief Sina. Muchas gracias. He turned and walked to the gate. Hasta luego. Until then. Hasta luego, Papa, and I said. Hasta go, said Willie, waving as the chief mounted his red horse. I watched him ride away, wondering if there would ever be a luego. Then. Saturday, May 10th. The war goes on. Union forces have won some victories along the Mississippi River. At the end of April, they attacked New Orleans from the Gulf and now occupy it. Again, at a great loss of lives on both sides. It is madness. Here at home, Lena turned 1 week old today. This morning, I took her out on the gallery and sat down in the rocker. As I held her in the crook of my arm, she stared at me with her blue eyes, Mama's eyes. Gusta Morgan, Lena said. I am Sophie. She blinked. After a time of rocking, she closed her eyes and slept. Her warm little body limp in my arms. I could see Papa, Willie, and Arliss, our hired man, working on the rock fence between the road and our cornfield. Arliss was breaking rock. Willie brought small pieces to Papa for filling the cracks between the larger ones. Beyond Papa and Willie, a blue haze hung over the distant hills. The sky was white with heat clouds. It cannot rain, seemingly, and the corn will not bear unless it does. I could hear the stalks in the breeze saying, please, please. Sunday, May 11th. Mama let me go to another meeting of the Comfort Militia this afternoon. When Papa and I enter the schoolhouse, a group of men standing near the door greets us. Ah, the new fathers, said Ir Alget. Congratulations, Frederic. He turned to me with a little bow. Fraulein Sophie, are you enjoying your little sister? Ja, mein Herr. I nodded and went to join Tante Emma. She sat alone like a queen, smiling at me. I am pleased to see you here, Sophie. I trust your mother and Lena are doing well. Ja, with Rosina's help. Goot. And what about you? Were you still keeping your journal? Ja, but not every day, only when I have something significant to write. She leaned closer. Allow me a word of advice from one to another. She put her hand around her mouth and whispered in my ear. Don't let men distract you from your course. You must write even if you want to bear their children instead. I felt blood rush to my face. Without thinking, I glanced around and saw Edward on the other side of the room. He was looking at me, and something inside me dissolved. Is that what Tante Emma means? I think it is. So here in my journal, I resolved not to be dissolved by anyone. Just then, Herr Uhrmann tapped his pipe on the table, and the men stopped talking. I noticed that the boys had not come today. You all know what happened at Frederick's place last week. Herr Uhrmann began. These ruffians came in numbers, so we must meet them with numbers. He leaned forward. I mean no disrespect, Frederick, but you should have sounded the alarm. We need each other if we're going to protect our families. There were murmurs of agreement, and Herr Algi stood. Remember, Meinen Fruden, we are all in the midst of the Confederacy. We are surrounded by those who believe in the South's way of life. Indeed, I agree with them.